Welcome everybody. In the previous video, I've explained why you might want to use the minimal API structure over the current controller API structure. With more features being added to the minimal APIs like Swagger support, Microsoft is probably envisioning it being used in production. So we're going to look towards that direction and see how can we implement it for that production scenario, having it structured, maintainable, and still reap some rewards. The rewards that we're reaping, if you don't know what I'm talking about, go watch the previous video. Otherwise, let's go ahead, open up Program CS. We're going to take a look. You can take a look at it for a couple of seconds and tell me what it does. Without really diving deep into add API services, we can say, yeah, that's just adding some classes to be used all over this place. Anonymous endpoints, you can see which routes, and then you essentially have a pointer to the piece of functionality responsible for handling this route. And then you have the admin section. These curl comments are really just commands for me to do some demonstration in a couple of minutes. Let's go ahead and see it work first. So we have blogs. I'm going to refresh it, right? There's nothing there. And then I'm going to come back to here and I'm just going to create a blog post. I'll just run the curl command here. Here's the post that we've created, right? Blogs, refresh, there's the post. We can go ahead and query it by ID, and there is our one post, or one blog rather. And we can see who it's been created by. Let's go ahead and look at the internal structures, look at what it's doing, because all we've seen so far are essentially just endpoints. However, as somebody who creates endpoints and creates APIs, really you should know. Blogs, you are going to list blogs/ID. You're going to get a blog, and then a post to blogs. You're going to create a blog, put to blogs. You're going to update a blog. If it's on a /ID, right, you are hard writing the document. Delete is archive, and so on and so forth. First, let's dive into the get blogs request. Here's the request file, and here's the handler for this request. If you've used Mediator before, this is essentially the idea copied from there, and I find it very fitting. I have a blog request and then I handle it, and you see there is dependency injection in here. Now you can get a sense of the idea of what is in this add API services. What I have essentially is assembly scanners. I scan an assembly for these specific classes, and then I add them to the dependency injection container. And then internally in these methods, I resolve these services. Nothing too complicated there. Again, code is available. You can take a look at it if you want. Let's take a look at one more example. We have only one post, and let's say we access post 0. We have a failed validation and ID needs to be more than 0. All right. So we do still have validation in here. Let's go ahead and see how this is happening. We have get blog request. Again, we go in here, and in this file, we have 3 classes. You have the get blog request. At the moment, I add methods for model binding, and you will see the variation of these model binding requests in just a minute. But you have your request. You may take some values from the route, and if you're saying that this may be polluting your business logic, understand this is only inheriting from interfaces. Your business logic object could be another thing that we inherit from. And this request object can really be just the glue for all the things combined of what the actual business logic is that you're inheriting from, and then how do you glue it to this HTTP framework, how it's going to parse that request from where. Because let's be honest, the requests don't usually get parsed just from a body, just from a query, just from a route. Values can come from anywhere, right? And this is meant to kind of appeal to that and bring visibility to where are you taking the values from. Next, you have a validator. I do the same thing with the validator as I do with these services. I scan my assemblies for them and I just add them to the dependency injection container. How I resolve them, again, we will take a look at how that happens in a minute. But simple rule, this is fluent validation. If you don't know anything about fluent validation, go look at a tutorial, or I recommend documentation. It's pretty simple. Then again, we have dependency injection. We just grab stuff from the database and that's it. Taking a look at the final service, here we have create blog request. You will see the created by. We have authentication, and we're essentially loading the username from the claims principal. And you have your initial I from JSON body. So we parse this request from JSON body, and then we bind something from the user context. And then finally, this object gets handled and saved to the database. Okay. I didn't put validation in here just because I was lazy, but there it is. Endpoints describing your API and pointing to a piece of functionality that is handling that endpoint. I then have these anonymous and admin wrappers, which are not too complicated. All they do is just for each endpoints that you are passing into them, they will attach whatever policy you want. So allow anonymous, I mean, pretty self-explanatory, and admin policy. If you have some other custom policies, just, you know, create another function, and you get to wrap and create these areas as we've seen in the MVC world and in the previous video. This is an area for admins, this is an area for anonymous calls, and it's all described here. And again, as I explained in the previous video, still preserves this table of contents structure. Let's take a look at how this service registration looks like. We've taken a look at this anonymous and admin. We're basically just registering authentication policies. Then we have register services, and register services has this add API services. We're just extending the iService collection. We register AppDB context, and then we have two functions which are add services and add validation. These are my assembly scanners. So let's just quickly take a look at them. They're still in the same file, and these are two methods. I gave a generic type here, and really I should be using it here to scan assemblies. And I'm just looking for anything that implements abstract validators. I registered behind an iValidator type with the generic argument of the abstract validator being the generic argument of the iValidator. So iValidator of getBlog has an implementation of whatever type has a base class of abstract validator of that with that same generic argument. So if we take a look at, for example, getBlog requests, where I have the validator, right? We scan for types that implement abstract validators. We grab this type, getBlog request. We create a generic interface, so iValidator getBlog request with an implementation of whatever type we scanned originally here. So getBlog request validation will be the implementation for this interface. Hopefully I haven't rattled on there for too long, but add services works in the same way. We are basically just looking for classes that are extending this handler type. And then you have your interface and your implementation. For me, implementations here are of type handler, right? So these are these abstract classes. So first I select a tuple of type T with base type. So for example, for getBlog, you will have getBlog with a base type of handler. And that's really all there is. These are not too complicated. Feel free to go over these in your own spare time, right? Just scan an assembly, load services into the dependency injection container. We're going to take a look at how those get resolved and triggered in a couple of minutes. For add authentication, we have just a default authentication of JWT bearer. What I'm doing is I'm instantiating a new instance of events where I'm creating a new event, which basically means I want to add my custom handling of the token that I provide. So it doesn't have to be a JWT token. I can give whatever you want in whatever header. I can then look at the context, scan the header. It may be some GUID, and then in here I can look in the database for whatever, you know, that record is relating to. I, however, choose I'm not going to look in the database. I'm not going to try to de-encrypt the token. I'll go ahead and seed some kind of user here, and that's exactly what I do. Calls to the database could be made here. If JWT is publicly readable, I just load the claims from there and maybe do some validation here. But hopefully you get the picture here. This is essentially mocking authentication. And then for add authorization for the admin policy, I require an authenticated user, and I would just require him to be authenticated under this bearer scheme. And that's what the admin policy is for this admin service registration endpoints. Okay, that's pretty much all to the services that I'm adding. So I'm loading my database, I'm loading my services and validation for those services, and then I just add some authentication. In live applications, you will have a little bit more services. However, this should give you a clear idea that you can use services within your handlers. Okay, you can still do as you've been doing before. A lot of people like Mediator and this modular format, kind of like Razor Pages, but for your API handlers. I think Razor Pages are pretty good, and I actually like this format. So there you have it. Now let's go ahead and take a look at this map get. How does it bind this getBlog request to this blog endpoint with validation, with model binding, and essentially service resolution? We have our map gets. and map post, these all they do is take the same string pattern and they just bind this request handler as the lambda to handle that request, okay? And specifically, the method that they're using is the one that supplies the request delegate. This is what this function is. It's essentially a request delegate. This function does three things. It model binds the request, it tries to validate that request, and then it handles that request. This is hardly integrated into a step of each individual endpoint. This can be moved down to the middleware. It can be part of these steps. It can be its own middleware pipeline, how it is in Mediator. Okay, there's flexibility in where you can put these steps. Don't take this as the final structure. This was just the easiest thing for me to work with. Let's take a look at the model binding. You've seen me add these interfaces. You specify on your request where data gets loaded from, and that's all we're doing. So we have the T request that is of type iRequest. We get that type, we scan for its interfaces. If it says that it's from JSON body, we originally try to deserialize it from that. Otherwise, we just instantiate a new type. We then check, is it a from route? If it's a from route, then we try to bind from route. If it's a from query, we try to bind from query. And if it's with user context, we pass the user context into it, and then it can bind whatever information it wants from the user context. By the time we're done with this model binding, we have our request, then we try to validate it. So validating, I'm using, again, Fluent validation. Kind of similarly, how I load services, I have to forge this generic type. So we have this validator type interface, and then I use the dependency injection container, or rather the iService provider, to get my registered validator. I then have my validation context. I run the validation context against the validator, and then I'm going to get a result. It's basically going to run the validation registered in the get blog request validation, okay? It's smart that way. So looking at the validation next, if we're not validated, all I'm doing is I'm just parsing all the errors and giving out this format here, which I think we had here. Yep. So that's a JSON format. You have your property and you have your error message. This can be an array, and then in JavaScript you can have some kind of reusable component, because the validation errors are all going to look the same. You can always parse them and then automatically try to bind them to the properties of the JavaScript form that you have there, or if you're using Blazor, do the same thing there. Okay, but anyway, that's a validation. If we fail validation, which is this clause, we return false. If we pass validation, we return true. So that's what happens here. If validate async, if that's a nope, we return, because we've already written the response here and given a status code of 400. Again, this is not written in stone. As I mentioned before, this could sit in the middleware. You could provide your iValidation options, and in the iValidation options, you will have a property that says status code on validation failed. You can supply your options in here. This can be a service in and of itself that could be resolved from the dependency injection container. Again, there are things that you can do here, and just to again point out to the comment where when people are getting upset that it's a single file API, again, it's just your laziness to not be able to clean the code up. Okay, you can build these frameworks. And yeah, final but not least, you have the handle async. We just pass the what's called the request into there, do some reflection to get a bunch of types. We get an iHandler, and then the handler, we basically run the request against the handler. We get a result, and I'm just writing it as JSON. There's a couple of things here. If I don't get back an object, how do I write it as JSON? Let's say this returns an integer, a boolean, or a string. You can put some if statements here, I am sure of it. Otherwise, let's go ahead and take a look at the interfaces of the framework a little bit. The web application extensions that we've been just looking for are in the framework folder as well. Route value extensions are just something of a convenience to basically be able to say get blog, and from route we get the ID, right? So in the program we're saying /ID, so we want to get this ID from the route values. Okay, build these tools for yourself to make working in your code base a good experience. We have the handler there and the request, pretty standard stuff. If you've ever taken a look at Mediator, this is kind of what you're going to find. For the request objects, I have the iRequest, I from query, I from route, I with user context, I from JSON body, and then iRequest T out. This is just to make sure that the handler, the handler interface here is being followed. So for the parameter that you're supplying, you're following the rules of what you're returning. There may be a question of performance, so let's take a look at this. We're using reflection, type checking all over the place, and you must be thinking this impacts performance. I'm gonna say this doesn't impact performance enough, and I've seen Nick Chapsa's test performances with this, and I basically copied from his video because I thought, well, I am using a lot of reflection, this must impact performance, so I'm just gonna do what Nick Chapsa's did, and I'm gonna use nbomber to test the performance of this test request endpoint. So the test request endpoint basically says, I have a request that returns an object. Title should be bound from iJSON body. From route is the value that's going to get bound from route. And from query, we're going to get this v value, right? So we're binding a value from 3 places, body, query, and route. And I'm just going to return an object with a result of string. For the MVC application here, program is really simple. We're mapping controllers. We have the test controller with a controller base, and we're doing the same thing. We have an HTTP post. We're posting to a route test with ID. We have from query of string v, which is pretty much the same thing here for a test file here. Query v from route ID, and then the body should get just deserialized so we get the title. And the same thing here. So from body we get test request. And here, for me, this breaks the structure of functions having 1 parameters means infinite composability, because everything takes 1 parameter and everything returns 1 parameter. It just kind of gives you function composition by default. But anyway, this is what we're looking at, and they should return the same results. The way we test this, we can have this curl request here, 5000/test1. Again, this is the same endpoint here. ID is 1. V is test, and the body is test body. Okay, so I'm gonna run this from the command line. In the other tab, I have a minimal API running here, and I have MVC running here, MVC on port 5001. So first, we're just gonna make sure that it works. So this is minimal API, and I mean, we get the result, and this is MVC API. So on a different port, we get the same result right there. Pretty much the same test case as Nick Chapsa's had. I haven't really used nbomber until I've seen his video, so I really recommend you go watch those. I'm just gonna run this where I have a JSON content. I'm just gonna post it to the MVC API, which is this one, and then to the minimal API, which is this one, and then nbomber is gonna do its magic to compare. So let's run that, and we'll check back in a couple of seconds. So here are the results. Let's take a look. Minimal API scenario, we are running mini API, which is this one for the minimal API scenario, and MVC, which is this one for MVC scenario. If you've already had a glimpse, basically this is what happens. For minimum API, we have requests per second in the 10,000 range. In the MVC scenario, we have requests per second in the 9,000 range. That's all the metrics that I'm gonna look at. They are pretty close, so the minimal API I think is still at a bit of a disadvantage because I don't think I'm using, I'm not using fluent validation here, or I'm not doing any service resolution. The base functionality that you get with the test controllers against all that functionality that's kind of bolted on there, the minimal API is still a little bit faster. Take what you want from there. Again, as I said in the previous video, performance for me is not the critical bit. The thing that I'm going to go after when I'm using minimal APIs is this structure, this table of contents, this instantaneous way of discovering what your API is about, really having a useful table of contents. I mean, I'm just going to keep using that word because I think it's such a good description. And the current structure when we have program CS and startup CS, having a bunch of things in there being mixed in with the routes really kind of never allowed it. And with the MVC controllers being provided, I guess it never really swung this way where you can have a route and just map it to a handler, which I think is what Node.js Express does, and maybe Python Flask, I can't remember exactly, but again, hopefully this example illustrates to you that you can have structures to your minimal APIs to take it to that production grade structure and maintainability with your modular handlers and etc. Feel free to take whatever ideas you want from this once aspnetcore 6 is released, I'm probably going to make like a little mini library, which I can just pull in to give me this structure. This will be it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions, suggestions about the minimal APIs, or comments or things that you have explored, I'm actually interested in what you've done with minimal APIs, so do go ahead and tell me in the comments, or on the Discord server, do share your code bases. As always, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.